The stage lights may have dimmed long ago, but the echo of his voice still lingers like a heartbeat beneath the history of American soul. Before the world knew his name, Syl Johnson stood in smoky Chicago clubs, pouring every ounce of himself into a sound that refused to be forgotten. He was a pioneer of funk, a master of raw emotion, and an artist who fought harder than most to keep his music his own. How does someone so influential slip through the cracks of mainstream memory? And why does his story feel even more powerful today? Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Long before the world recognized the depth of his voice or the grit of his harmonica, Syl Johnson began his story in a quiet corner of Holly Springs, Mississippi. Born on the 1st of July 1936, he entered a world marked by cotton fields, church choirs, and the slow, rhythmic pulse of Southern life. His earliest memories weren't of fame or possibility, but of long roads, wooden porches, and a family bound together by music. His father played harmonica with the kind of soul that didn't need an audience. His brothers, Matt and Jimmy, would grow into musicians themselves. Music wasn't entertainment in the Johnson household, it was a language, a way of surviving, a way of holding on. But life in Mississippi carried its own weight. The opportunities were scarce, and the expectations for a young black boy in the South were painfully low. Even as Syl absorbed the sounds around him, he understood that if he wanted something more, he would have to leave the place he called home. That turning point came in the early 1950 decade, when his family joined the wave of black families moving north in search of better futures. Chicago was their destination, a city alive with ambition, promise, and a growing blues scene that would shape Syl's life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Chicago in those years was a different universe from Mississippi. The sounds were louder, the streets were busier, and the nights stretched long with music pouring out of clubs across the South Side. Syl found himself surrounded by legends in the making. Magic Sam lived nearby. The blues wasn't something he had to chase, it lived around the corner, in the air he breathed. In this new world, Syl discovered not only his voice but his courage. He learned quickly, jumping between instruments, absorbing everything. The boy who once listened to music from the edge of a porch was now playing it in front of people who understood its truth. By the mid to late 1950 decade, Syl Johnson wasn't just studying music, he was stepping into it. He began performing with some of the greatest blues artists of the era: Magic Sam, Billy Boy Arnold, Howlin' Wolf, and Junior Wells. These weren't small moments. These were the crucibles where young talent either broke under pressure or learned to rise. Syl chose to rise. His voice carried a rawness that felt lived in, and his harmonica cut through the noise with a tone that was uniquely his. Still, the life of a young musician was far from glamorous. Money was tight, record labels were unpredictable, and stability was something Syl could only dream about. So, he kept a day job as a truck driver, waking up early, working long hours, then heading straight to small clubs to perform at night. Those nights were where he found himself. The lights were dim, the crowds modest, but every note brought him closer to who he was meant to be. In 1959, everything shifted when he performed and recorded with Jimmy Reed for VJ Records. It was one of his first steps into professional recording, a small doorway into a much larger world. Not long after, Federal Records owner Sid Nathan encouraged him to change his stage name from Sylvester Thompson to Syl Johnson. It was a simple change, but meaningful. It gave him a sharper identity, one that carried confidence and clarity. That same year, he released his debut solo single on Federal Records with Teardrops and I Found a Love. The songs didn't climb the charts the way he hoped, but they were proof that he belonged in the studio. They were the first official recordings of a man who had something to say even if the world wasn't ready to listen yet. The years that followed were a mix of small victories and quiet frustrations. Syl recorded for several smaller labels, performed in tighter rooms, and kept pushing forward. He was building something, not fame, not yet, but a foundation. His sound was sharpening, his confidence growing, his storytelling deepening. Every stage he stepped onto, whether crowded or nearly empty, became a chapter in the journey that would eventually define him. And as the 1960 decade approached, a new opportunity emerged when Syl Johnson began recording for Twilight Records. The company would later become known as Twilight Records, and it was there that Syl's early promise began to turn into something real. Songs like Come On, Sock It to Me, Different Strokes, and Come On and Dance started generating attention. For the first time, Syl wasn't just another voice in Chicago. He was becoming a presence, a musician whose songs felt alive, spirited, and unmistakably his. But behind every rising star lies the story of a dream carried from childhood. A dream held by a boy who once looked out at endless Mississippi fields and dared to believe that his voice could carry farther than anyone imagined. And now, standing at the edge of his breakthrough, Syl Johnson was ready to take that dream into the next chapter of his life. By the time the 1960 decade came into view, Syl Johnson was no longer just a promising young musician. He was becoming a force that Chicago could feel, a restless, determined artist, sharpening his identity with every performance. When he first stepped into the orbit of Twilight Records, the match felt natural. The label may have been small, but it carried a hunger that mirrored Syl's own. In those early studio sessions, something began to shift. The sound he had been shaping in clubs and late-night rehearsals finally found a home where it could breathe. Twilight Records eventually changed its name to Twilight Records, and under that banner, Syl Johnson began to carve out a musical identity that stood apart from the crowd. The first sparks came with songs like Come On, Sock It to Me. It wasn't just catchy, it was energetic, spirited, and stamped with the gritty Chicago soul that fans craved. Soon after came Different Strokes, a track that would one day become one of the most sampled songs in American music history. But back then, in those early days, it was simply Syl experimenting with rhythm, swagger, and his growing confidence as a songwriter. What made Syl unique wasn't just his voice, though. His voice carried a punch, a sweetness, and a rawness all at once. It was his versatility. He produced, he arranged, he played multiple instruments. While other artists waited for labels to mold them, Syl molded himself. He didn't walk into rooms asking for opportunities. He brought the opportunities with him. His songs had a snappy joy, a forward motion, a sense that something real and human was happening behind the microphone. Working at Twilight also allowed Syl to become more than a performer. He became an anchor for the label, guiding its sound and shaping records for other artists. In a time when many black musicians struggled for control over their own music, Syl found a way to assert his vision. His studio sessions were known for their intensity. He expected the best from his musicians, from the engineers, and from himself. That discipline, rooted in the long nights of his earlier years, became a defining part of his rise. Then came 1968, a year that would help cement Syl's place in Chicago soul. With the release of Dress Is Too Short, he stepped into the spotlight with a swagger that was impossible to ignore. The song was bold, playful, and unmistakably his. The success of the single gave Syl the momentum he needed to release his debut album, also titled Dress Is Too Short. For the first time, he wasn't just generating attention, he was commanding it. But beneath the upbeat rhythms and danceable grooves, another part of Syl's artistry was beginning to surface. He was watching the world change around him. The civil rights movement, the tension in his community, the questions of identity and justice that filled the air. These experiences were taking root in his songwriting, quietly pushing him toward the next chapter of his career, a chapter where he would no longer write just to entertain, but to express what it meant to be a black man in America. Syl Johnson had climbed from Mississippi fields to Chicago clubs, from small labels to regional hits. Now, standing on the edge of deeper recognition, he was ready to let his voice carry truth, power, and purpose. And the world was finally beginning to listen. By the end of the 1960 decade, Syl Johnson was no longer just a spirited voice from the Chicago scene. He had grown into an artist with something urgent to say, and the world around him was shifting in ways that demanded honesty. The civil rights movement was at its height. Streets were filled with marches, headlines carried unrest, and black communities across America were fighting to be seen. Syl felt the weight of that moment, not as an observer, but as a man living inside it. And when he stepped into the studio in 1969, he channeled everything he felt into a single question. Is it because I'm black? The song wasn't built for the dance floors. It wasn't meant to charm radio stations or please record executives. It was a cry slow, aching, and unfiltered. Syl Johnson delivered each line with the exhaustion of a man who had lived through disappointment and the fire of someone refusing to surrender to it. The record captured the tension of the era: frustration, sorrow, truth, and a fragile hope that refused to die. It became one of the most powerful musical statements of its time, resonating deeply within Black America. For many listeners, Syl wasn't singing at them, he was singing for them. When the song grew in popularity, Syl followed it with an album of the same name in 1970. The project allowed him to step fully into the role of storyteller, using his music as a mirror to reflect the lived experiences of Black men and women across the country. Songs like Concrete Reservation and One-Way Ticket to Nowhere brought social commentary into a soul framework, creating a space where discomfort and beauty lived side by side. It wasn't commercial soul. It wasn't polished pop. It was the truth, and that truth gave Syl an identity no one else could claim. But the real turning point came when producer Willie Mitchell heard Syl's work and saw potential beyond the Chicago scene. Willie was building a signature sound at High Records in Memphis: warm, smooth, emotionally rich. It was a sound that fit Syl's voice like a perfectly tailored suit. When the invitation came to join the High Records family, Syl understood how important that moment was. It was a chance to grow, to expand, to step onto a stage that reached far beyond regional success. Walking into High Records in the early 1970 decade felt like stepping into a new life. The studio was alive with creativity. Horn sections drifted down hallways. Musicians moved in and out of sessions with an ease that only comes from years of playing together. And in the middle of it all was Willie Mitchell, shaping sound with the precision of a craftsman and the heart of a poet. For Syl Johnson, this wasn't just a new label, it was the beginning of a musical rebirth. Their first collaborations revealed something special. Willie brought out the richness in Syl's tone, highlighting the warmth of his mid-range and the grit that made his performances unforgettable. Syl brought his own fire, a funk edge, a sharp sense of rhythm, a willingness to push the music into deeper emotional territory. Together, they created something that carried the polish of Memphis soul but kept the bite of Syl's Chicago roots. With each recording session, the partnership grew stronger. Syl was no longer fighting for space, he had it. He was no longer searching for a sound, he had found it. And as the early 1970 decade unfolded, he stood at the threshold of the most successful period of his entire career. The rise had been long, it had been slow, but now, with the world finally listening, Syl Johnson was ready to make the kind of music that would define his legacy for generations. Even at the height of Syl Johnson's success with High Records, there were quiet shadows forming behind the bright studio lights. The music was strong, the performances were sharp, and his voice had reached a level of depth that few artists ever achieve. Yet beneath the surface, forces were beginning to shift, forces that Syl himself could feel but couldn't fully name. One of the earliest cracks appeared in the way High Records prioritized its roster. Willie Mitchell admired Syl deeply, but the label had another rising star who was quickly becoming the face of its sound: Al Green. Al's silky tone, smoother arrangements, and soaring commercial appeal drew the spotlight toward him. Radio stations leaned into his records, promoters booked his tours, labels pushed his singles, and while Syl Johnson continued to deliver powerful, emotionally charged songs, the industry machine tilted in favor of the artist who sold more, charted higher, and fit the softer soul that America craved at the time. Syl wasn't overshadowed creatively, he knew his craft, his grit, and his heart gave him something entirely his own. But commercially, the comparison was constant. Al Green's version of Take Me to the River received more airplay, even though Syl offered a rendition many fans considered equally compelling, if not more grounded. For Syl, the struggle wasn't jealousy. It was the frustration of watching his work stand in the same room as greatness, yet never being handed the same spotlight. Another wound opened inside the studio walls. As the High Records sound tightened under Willie Mitchell's direction, more in-house compositions began to replace Syl's original material. For an artist who had built his identity on writing, shaping, and controlling his narrative, this was a quiet blow. Syl was used to fighting for his space, but now he had to fight for his songs. Decisions were made above him, around him, without him. It wasn't enough to break him, but it chipped away at the creative freedom he valued. Outside the studio, the music industry was shifting. The landscape of soul was changing. Genres began to branch into smoother, softer territories that didn't always align with Syl's raw, blues-driven voice. The funk edge that made his work distinctive didn't always fit the commercial recipe labels were chasing. And in that evolving environment, being unique wasn't always an advantage. Syl Johnson still produced remarkable work during these years, albums that many fans now see as the peak of his artistry. But recognition didn't always follow. Journalists reviewed him less. Radio chose other voices. Promoters pushed bigger names. And slowly, the applause that once felt within reach began to fade into the distance. There is a particular kind of heartbreak that comes not from failure, but from being nearly great in a world that only rewards the loudest victories. Syl felt that heartbreak deeply. He wasn't falling. He wasn't fading. But the industry was shifting around him, leaving him to navigate the uncertain spaces between brilliance and visibility. And as the decade prepared to turn again, the glow of his peak years began to dim, not because his talent changed, but because the world's attention moved on. The seeds of decline had been planted quietly, almost invisibly, during the very years when Syl Johnson was singing at his strongest. As the 1970 decade drew to a close, the energy that had once fueled Syl Johnson's rise began to drain in ways that were subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Leaving High Records after years of creative tension, he stepped into the next stage of his career without the powerful support system that had once amplified his voice. What followed wasn't a dramatic fall, but a slow unraveling, the kind that often happens when an artist finds himself standing in a world that no longer looks familiar. The industry he had known was changing rapidly. Soul was shifting, funk was splintering into new directions, and disco was taking the spotlight with a force that pushed many veteran artists into the margins. Syl Johnson was no stranger to reinvention, but this new landscape didn't leave much room for raw, blues-rooted voices like his. He recorded Uptown Shakedown in 1979, pouring effort into keeping his music alive, but the album struggled to compete with the flashier trends shaping the market. Even for a man as resilient as Syl, the weight of being outpaced by the industry began to settle in. When he created his own label, Drama Records, the move reflected both independence and necessity. With fewer opportunities coming his way, he turned inward, taking control of the production process, the business, and the creative vision. But running a label without major backing was a constant battle. Distribution was limited, radio support was inconsistent, and without a promotional machine behind him, even strong songs could vanish before they ever reached listeners. The music world was moving on, and Syl could feel it. As the 1980 decade began, he found himself stepping away from the center of the stage. The calls slowed. The tours became sparse. The familiar excitement of studio work faded into silence. Instead of chasing the industry that no longer opened its doors, Syl Johnson shifted his focus to survival. The same survival instincts that had carried him from Mississippi fields to Chicago clubs now guided him into new ventures. He opened a chain of seafood restaurants. He invested in real estate. These weren't backup plans. They were lifelines. And while they kept him afloat financially, they could not replace the feeling of a microphone in his hand, a band behind him, or an audience leaning in as he let his stories unfold through song. What made this period so difficult wasn't the loss of fame. Syl had never chased fame for its own sake. It was the quietness, the space where music used to be. The sense that the world he helped shape no longer had a place ready for him. He made occasional appearances in blues clubs, and during those rare performances, the spark returned, reminding everyone, including himself, of who he was. But those nights were moments, not momentum. And so the crisis of Syl Johnson's life wasn't a single event. It was a gradual dimming of the world around him, a fading spotlight that left him standing alone on a stage that had once been filled with sound. For most artists, the decline would have ended there, a quiet step back, a gentle fade into memory. But for Syl Johnson, the next chapter arrived in a way no one, including him, could have predicted. In the early 1990 decade, hip-hop exploded into mainstream culture, and with it came a wave of sampling that reshaped the sound of modern music. Young producers, searching for soul, grit, and authenticity, dug through crates of old vinyl until they found exactly what they needed. Syl's voice, Syl's rhythms, Syl's heartbeat. Suddenly, tracks he recorded decades earlier became the foundation for a new generation of music. Different Strokes in particular became a gold mine, chopped, looped, flipped, and resurrected in ways Syl had never imagined. Wu-Tang Clan, Public Enemy, De La Soul, Cool G Rap, MC Hammer, the Ghetto Boys, they all found pieces of their sound inside Syl Johnson's work. He wasn't in the studio with them, but his fingerprints were everywhere. At first, Syl felt a spark of curiosity, then recognition, then disbelief. His music, the same music that had once struggled to find radio play, had become essential to an entirely new era. But the celebration came with a bitter truth. Many of the samples were used without permission. His name wasn't credited. His contribution wasn't acknowledged. The industry that had once overlooked him was now taking from him in silence. Syl Johnson was not a man to let silence speak for him. He believed deeply in artistic ownership. He knew the sacrifices he had made, the hours he had spent shaping his craft, the pain and joy buried inside every note. And as he listened to hit after hit built on pieces of his work, he felt something he couldn't ignore, not anger, but injustice. A sense that history was repeating itself, taking from the artist without honoring the man. So he fought back. He confronted labels. He confronted artists. He filed lawsuits and demanded compensation. Syl didn't always win, but he refused to disappear quietly. To him, it wasn't only about money. It was about dignity. It was about respect. It was about making sure that the world finally recognized what he had given and what he was owed. As he once said, "There's no such thing as a sample. Stealing is stealing." His battles drew attention. Some called him difficult. Others called him bold. But many artists, especially younger ones, began to see him as a pioneer not just in music, but in asserting the rights of creators. He had become a reluctant guardian of his own legacy. In the final stretch of his life, Syl returned to music with renewed purpose, releasing multiple albums and performing when he could. But the years of conflict, the weight of financial and emotional strain, and the quiet ache of being undervalued left their mark. When he passed away on the 6th of February, 2022, just 6 days after his brother Jimmy, the world lost not only a funk and soul innovator, but a man who spent his life fighting to be heard. The consequences of his decline were not just personal, they were historical. They revealed what happens when an artist gives everything, only to watch the world take without asking. Yet even in that struggle, Syl Johnson carved out something few artists ever achieve. A legacy that cannot be erased. Legacy is a word often reserved for artists who stood in the center of the spotlight, who lived their lives surrounded by applause and accolades. But Syl Johnson's legacy was shaped in quieter places, in the grooves of vinyl records, in the echoes of his voice carried across generations, and in the countless songs that borrowed pieces of his genius without ever speaking his name. It is the kind of legacy that reveals itself slowly, like a truth that refuses to stay hidden. One of the most remarkable pieces of Syl Johnson's influence is the sheer scale of his presence in modern music. By the time hip-hop matured into a dominant cultural force, Syl had quietly become one of the most sampled musicians in history. Different Strokes alone became a foundation for producers who were building a new language of rhythm, grit, and storytelling. Those short bursts of drums, those vocal shouts, those raw musical fragments, they became the backbone of tracks that defined an era. For millions of listeners who never knew his name, Syl was already woven into the soundtrack of their lives. Yet this influence was never just about sampling. The emotional honesty in Syl's voice set him apart. He carried the depth of Mississippi blues, the punch of Chicago soul, and the urgency of Memphis grooves all in one breath. Songs like "Is It Because I'm Black" didn't just express pain, they embodied a moment in American history when the fight for equality was burning through every community. The sincerity of that record continues to resonate, not only as a piece of music but as a cultural document. Even today, listeners hear its message and feel the weight of the world Syl was singing about. Artists, critics, and scholars have noted that Syl Johnson stood at the intersection of two powerful traditions, the storytelling of blues and the bold experimentation of funk. Very few artists carried both worlds with such conviction. His ability to move between styles wasn't a strategy, it was who he was. A man shaped by migration, shaped by struggle, shaped by the belief that music could carry truth even when truth was hard to hear. Beyond America, Syl's influence drifted across oceans. European DJs and collectors, always drawn to the authenticity of American soul, rediscovered his records in the late decades of his life. Clubs in London, Paris, Berlin, and Tokyo started spinning his tracks long before mainstream listeners in the United States realized they had forgotten him. To those global audiences, Syl Johnson represented something rare, a voice untouched by commercial compromise, a sound built on emotion rather than perfection. His family carried that legacy forward, too. His daughter, Syl Johnson, emerged as a respected singer in her own right, her voice echoing the same emotional depth that defined her father's work. Through her music, and through the generations of musicians he influenced, Syl's spirit continued to move into the future. What stands out most is that Syl Johnson's legacy didn't come from awards or platinum plaques. It came from impact, real, measurable, undeniable impact. He shaped genres he never fully benefited from. He inspired artists who grew famous without knowing his full story. And he left behind a body of work that continues to reveal its importance decade after decade. Syl's legacy is a reminder that greatness is not always recognized on time. Sometimes it takes years for the world to catch up to what an artist was trying to say. When the news of Syl Johnson's passing spread on the 6th of February 2022, something unexpected happened. The world paused. Writers, critics, musicians, and fans, many of whom had gone years without hearing his name, suddenly reached back into memory, searching for the man whose music had shaped far more than they realized. It was as if a quiet truth had risen to the surface. Syl Johnson had never really disappeared. The world had simply taken too long to acknowledge him. In the United States, tributes came from every corner of the musical map. Soul enthusiasts remembered the grit of his early Chicago recordings. Blues historians honored his roots in Mississippi and the South Side. Hip-hop artists, some of the biggest names in the genre, expressed gratitude for the foundation he had unknowingly given them. Producers spoke openly about how the textures of Syl's music had changed the way they understood rhythm. Younger rappers admitted they had grown up hearing pieces of him without knowing the man behind the samples. For many black listeners, Syl Johnson represented a deeper story, a reminder of how often trailblazers in their community created brilliance without receiving the respect they deserved. His fight for credit in the 1990 decade was not just a legal battle, it was a cultural moment, one that forced the industry to confront how casually it had taken from him. After his passing, that fight was reframed not as stubbornness, but as protection. Protection of history, protection of identity, protection of the truth of his contribution. Globally, the reflection carried a different tone, one of discovery mixed with guilt. In Europe and parts of Asia, where music collectors had cherished Syl's vinyl for decades, his death reminded audiences how easily American culture can overlook some of its greatest storytellers. Japanese soul collectors posted photographs of his albums, treating them like sacred artifacts. British DJs paid homage to the breaks and grooves they had built entire club nights around. In France and Germany, radio shows devoted entire segments to revisiting his catalog, acknowledging how deeply his sound had seeped into their musical landscapes. What made these reflections so powerful was the realization that Syl Johnson had lived long enough to see his music resurrected, but not long enough to receive the full recognition he deserved. His life had been marked by talent, perseverance, injustice, and rediscovery, a complicated journey that mirrored the path of many underrated American artists. Yet his story carried a special weight. It revealed how an artist's true value often becomes clear only when the world finally looks back with honesty rather than convenience. In the years since his passing, a growing chorus of voices has begun calling for Syl to be honored properly. Some argue that his contributions to soul and funk make him worthy of a museum spotlight. Others believe his impact on hip-hop alone justifies a place among the most influential figures in modern music history. Fans still debate which Hall of Fame he belongs in: blues, soul, R&B, or even a special category dedicated to sampling pioneers. The real answer is simple: he belongs in all of them. Through that reflection, something else has taken shape across America and the world, a desire to make sure Syl Johnson's story is no longer overlooked. His music is studied, his interviews are shared, his lyrics are quoted. and his legacy is finally being pieced together with the respect he fought so hard to protect. In the end, Syl's reflection in history is clear. He was not forgotten. He was simply waiting for the world to catch up. In the quiet moments, when the stage lights dim and the world grows still, you can almost hear it, that unmistakable tone of Syl Johnson's voice, carrying the weight of every journey he ever walked. It's the same feeling that opened our story, the same echo that never quite disappears. His harmonica, his grit, his soul, they linger like a warm memory rising from the back of an old record store. Time may have moved on, but the music he left behind still breathes with the urgency of a man who refused to be forgotten. From Mississippi fields to Chicago nights, from the glow of studio sessions to the long stretches of silence that tested him, Syl's life reminds us that greatness doesn't always come wrapped in applause. Sometimes it lives quietly in the people who keep showing up, who keep creating, who keep fighting even when the world turns away. Syl Johnson lived that truth. He gave his voice to joy, to pain, to celebration, to struggle. And in doing so, he built a legacy strong enough to outlast the years that tried to push him aside. His journey wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was real, deeply, beautifully real. Through every breakthrough, every setback, every stolen piece of his work that found new life in another artist's hands, Syl held on to what mattered most, the belief that his music had meaning. And today, as listeners across generations rediscover him, that belief is finally being honored. What remains is not just the sound of a pioneering soul and funk artist, but the story of a man who stood firm in the truth of who he was. A man who reminded us that recognition delayed is not recognition denied. A man whose voice, once overlooked, now rises with the clarity it always deserved. So now the question belongs to you. Do you think Syl Johnson ever received the respect he truly earned? And what song of his still stays with you after all these years? If this story moved you, or brought back memories you thought you'd forgotten, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep the light alive for artists like Syl Johnson, artists whose stories deserve to be told, remembered, and passed on. Because the world may forget, but here, we honor the ones who shaped its sound.